Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with our DraftKings college football picks for Thursday night. We only have a 3-game slate on Thursday night, and I got to tell you guys, it's going to be really, really tough. Part of the reason why is because of the pricing, and I'll get into that in a second. First thing I want to do is just go over the spreads on these 3 games. Since there's only 3 of them, we could obviously get into it a little bit deeper than we normally do. The game that should be the one that everyone looks to target heavily is Louisiana Tech versus Western Kentucky. It's a spread. The over-under is 62, and Louisiana Tech is favored by 1 point right now. The line opened with Western Kentucky as a 3-point favorite, so this should be one of those back-and-forth kind of shootout-type games. The next game is Miami versus Florida Atlantic. Florida Atlantic played pretty well last week against Tulsa. But this Miami team seems to be a little bit more talented, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So I think it's going to be a little bit tougher for their offense this week than it was last week against Tulsa, which plays really fast and is more of an offensive-minded kind of team. The total in this game is 55, and Miami is favored by 17.5. So they're expecting a big game out of Miami here and expecting Florida Atlantic to really struggle. The last game on the slate is Utah and Utah State. This one isn't expecting a lot of points. Only 44 is the total here, and Utah's favored by 13.5. So you got to figure that they're expecting Utah to win this game, somewhere around like 31-14. So there isn't going to be a ton of scoring that comes out of this one. Now, here's where the dilemma comes for daily fantasy. If you look at the prices here today, let's go over the games first. This way you guys get a better idea of what I'm talking about here. Louisiana Tech versus Western Kentucky. Now, the best player on Louisiana Tech is running back Kenneth Dixon. Dixon was an absolute stud last year, scored like 28 touchdowns, had a little bit over 1,200 yards rushing, averaged over 5 yards per carry. Last week in their first game, he only touched the ball 11 times, but he had 9 rushes for 106 yards and 2 catches for like 65 yards, a touchdown on the ground and a touchdown through the air. So he is their main weapon. He is their big stud. He is the guy who they're going to be leaning on heavy. Now, they are the favorite here, so they should be the team that has the lead, which means they should see a lot of the running game out of them, which means that Dixon is a guy that you should be looking to play. Again, the problem here, though, is he's $10,400. So you get the top scoring player in the top scoring game. He's going to be a tough guy not to put on your roster. So it's just automatically assume that you decide that you want to put him on your roster. That's where you're really going to run into trouble, because it's going to be basically impossible to build a roster around him. But he is the best player. I mean, he is literally the one guy on that Louisiana Tech team that I really want to have. Not a huge fan of their quarterback today. He's somebody who transferred from Florida. He, was decent last year down in Florida. He had a big game the other day. But, I mean, they played I don't even know if it's a bowl division team that they played on opening week. So I'm not going to look at any of those stats and try to take too much from it. We know what Driscoll can do. We saw him at Florida. He's not a huge upside kind of guy. Even though this game does have a high total for it, like I said, I'm just not a huge fan of what he can give us. Now, on the other side, Western Kentucky, that Western Kentucky passing offense really looked pretty bad against Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt does have a decent SEC offense, defense, so they are better than the Louisiana Tech defense that they're going to see today. They did have their secondary pretty much intact from last year, so Vanderbilt wasn't the easiest matchup, but I think people just expected so much more out of that Western Kentucky team and just didn't see it from the passing game. So if you like a guy like Doty, I think you can link him up with his wide receivers. It looks like Dangerfield is likely to be out again. So, guys like Taylor and Grant could be in play. But again, the way the pricing is, if you want to do that, you're not going to be able to get a guy like Kenneth Dixon, who I think is probably the top play that I really want to try to fit into my rosters today. Same thing goes for Leon Allen. If you like Leon Allen more than you like Dixon, then I guess you can go for him. But if you want Dixon and Allen, you're not going to be able to fit them both into a roster. And we'll explain why in a minute. Moving on to that Florida Atlantic-Miami game. Miami has a running back by committee right now. I'm not a fan of their quarterback, Brad Kaya. Just not somebody that I'm going to pay $8,800 for, especially when they're favored to win by 17 and are likely to have a pretty run-heavy game script. Now, the run-heavy game script would favor the running back, but Miami doesn't really have a single running back. Joseph Yearby is the guy who is their starter right now, but they have a freshman kid named Mark Walton who they really, really like and are expecting big things out of in the future. Walton is 53, Yearby is 82. So for me, Yearby is somebody who I don't even think you can put into your rosters. I just think he's going to be way too expensive. $8,200 for a guy who's going to be part of a committee is not something I want to spend up on. Walton, I think, could be a sneakier option if you want to go cheap. But again, he's not somebody who's going to get the lion's share of the carries. He's probably going to, come in and spell Yearby a couple times in the first half, and he'll probably be the guy who's running the ball late in the third quarter or maybe even late in the fourth quarter to just run out the clock, because Miami does want to get him some touches and kind of see what they have with this kid. On the other side of the game, I think there are a couple guys on Florida Atlantic you might want to look at, but again, they're a 17-point underdog. So you can look at running back Greg Howe, who was somebody a lot of people used last week. And honestly, it's not that I think he has a good game script or I think he's got a great upside, but he's one of the cheapest running backs that's on the slate today. He's only $4,800. He was a great play last week. He had 2 touchdowns, over 100 yards, and was the cheap option that you really needed in order to fit in some of the big studs that you wanted. I don't think the game script sets up great for him here, but again, you have very limited options. I mean, for me, if you're going to use a guy like Dixon, you're going to wind up either using a guy like Howe or maybe a guy like Walton on the other side. And at least Howe, I know, is going to get some carries early on and might be involved a little bit in the passing game. So I like him a little bit more than I like Walton. And based on the way roster construction goes, I think you're almost forced to have to play one of those two guys. So I think there's going to be a lot of overlap here. And, like I said, when we get to the end and we talk about roster construction, you'll understand why. Let's see. You can look at Johnson at quarterback. I think he's a pretty good option. They're going to be throwing if they're down late. Had a pretty good game last week against Tulsa. He won some people some money. And he's going to hook up most likely with his top receiver, which is Jensen Stoshank. Stoshank was 7 catches for 114 yards and a touchdown last week against Tulsa. So he's pretty cheap. His price is only $5,100. So I think that he's somebody you can fit in there, and you can link up with a guy like Johnson and, actually try to make it work today, even if you are paying up at running back for, a stud like Dixon. The last game that we have here is Utah against Utah State. Now, this is going to be a blowout, 13.5-point spread with Utah. 44 points is the over-under total here. I don't think Utah's going to be passing much, so I'm not a big fan of Travis Wilson here. That also means I'm probably not going to be looking at a guy like, Kenneth Scott, although his price is in a place where I think you might have to use him today. So he would be somebody else that I would be looking at as well. The guy who's the big stud for them is going to be Devontae Booker. The question I think you really have to ask yourself is, do you think Booker has a bigger game in a 44-point total game where they're favored to win and he should be running late than a guy like Kenneth Dixon has in a game that's supposed to be close and has a 66-point total? For me, I think it's a clear answer. I'd rather have Dixon over Booker. But again, you're only going to be able to pay up for probably one of these guys. So for me, it's going to be Dixon. If you go with Booker, I think that could be a way to differentiate yourself in tournaments. But for me, I just think Dixon is far and away the best guy for cash games and even in your tournaments. I just think he's going to put up a pretty big number. He's going to get a huge amount of carries. He's going to get a huge line share of the work. And they're really expecting him to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Now, going over to my other computer here, here's the reason why I wanted to talk to you guys about roster construction. Basically, if you look at the quarterbacks that are available, if you're going to pay up for Doty, that means that you're giving up on Dixon. And like I said, I think Dixon is the one guy that's the key that you should start your lineups with. So I'm going to put Dixon in the running back spot right here. Now, once you do that, you really are left with such little money that there's not much else you can do. So if you look at the starting quarterbacks, you got Doty's at 10,100, Kaya's at 88, Driscoll's at 87, and then you go down to Travis Wilson at 71, Jaquez Johnson at 69, and Chucky Keaton, the quarterback for Utah State, at 63. Now, the only way I could build a roster that I don't completely, absolutely hate and throw 3 or 4 minimum price $3,000 guys in is if you go down to the bottom 2 quarterbacks. So Johnson is going to be trailing Miami, should be throwing the ball a lot. So I don't hate that altogether with his price below $7,000. I would rather use him over Travis Wilson, who's going to be favored and is probably going to be handing the ball off to Booker a lot. So I think Johnson is probably a guy who's definitely going to be in there. So that basically means that you're forced to use a guy like Chucky Keaton from Utah State because there's only 6 starting quarterbacks here. So unless you want to punt quarterback by taking a guy who doesn't even play just to, soak up the salary, I think Keaton and Johnson have to be the 2 that you put in there if you want to fit in either a Booker, a Dixon, or a Leon Allen at running back. If you don't have those 2 quarterbacks in there, you're not going to be able to fit in any of the really high-priced running backs that you want. So at that point, you put in a guy like Dixon as well at running back. Now you got to look for a second running back. And like I said, Booker and Allen are off the table because you won't have enough money left to round out a roster. If you do take them with the 2 cheapest quarterbacks that you can take, you still don't have enough money to round out a roster. So I think that what I'm going to do is go with a guy like Greg Howe in the FAU game. Even though it's not the greatest setup for him, his price is too good. The only other guy I could even think about is maybe going with a guy like Mark Walton, the freshman from Miami. He would be the only other guy I want to think about, unless you want to go complete stars and scrubs and have like 3 or 4 min-price guys in your roster. Now, once you do that, there's very few guys that are going to fit in. You're not going to be able to go up and get any of the high-priced receivers. So you're looking in that mid to lower range. So here are the options of the guys that I've been looking at. You could look at Western Kentucky tight end Tyler Higbee. That's a high over-under game. He had a couple catches. I think he had 100 yards, might have even had a touchdown last week. He was somebody that everybody liked. If you're playing on a site where you have a tight end, remember, DraftKings has the double flex now. But if you're playing on a site that has a tight end, I think Higbee's somebody that you definitely want to use. And I think I could even use him over here, basically because he's only 4,100 and you need some of those cheap options that can actually make some plays. Moving on from him, the cheapest guy that I like altogether is Utah State wide receiver Brandon Swindell. And let me explain to you why I think he makes for a great play here. You look at the Utah State receiving core. Hunter Sharp is their best receiver, and he's likely out again this week. So that means that you got to look for those other options. Devontae Robinson was somebody who they were counting on, and he's also questionable for this game after getting banged up in the game last week. So you're basically taking 2 of the top wide receivers out of the equation. Guy like Swindell had a good season a couple years ago. Then he got hurt last season, and they're expecting him to have a bounce back. Had a couple catches in the first game, was okay, wasn't great, but wasn't horrible either. But for a minimum price salary, to me, he's a guy that almost has to be in your roster. They're probably going to be losing to that Utah team, so they're going to be throwing the ball a lot late. So I think he can rack up some PPR points for you, and I'm hoping he can get me a touchdown. If he gets me the touchdown, he's going to pay his salary off easily, but I think he'll be able to do enough just with the yards and the PPR points to do it as well. And at that point, I mean, like I said, you want to try to have some exposure to that Western Kentucky game if you can. You're looking at the 2 wide receivers that they have. If Dangerfield doesn't play, you're looking at a guy like Antoine Grant, or you're looking at spending up a little more for a guy like Taylor. Those are basically the 2 guys that you want there. I think FAU is going to have to throw because they're going to be down against Miami. So Jensen Stoshank is somebody who I think I can put in there. He's only 5,100. I think he makes a great play, so he's somebody else that can fit in. And at that point, you're left with less than $5,000. So we haven't spent up. We haven't taken any top receivers. We haven't taken any of the, studs. We only really took one good, very good running back, but somebody who I think that you can't fade on a day. So now you're basically left with guys in that range of like a Kenneth Scott. Now, like I said, I don't like Kenneth Scott. I don't think this game really sets up well for him, but there just really aren't all that many plays down in that low level for you to take there. So I think there's going to be a ton of overlap here because I think a lot of people are going to run into these same situations. If you hear anything or see anything about a min-price guy that people are really talking up, by all means, try to put him in your roster. Other than Swindell, though, I can't really find anybody who I have a lot of confidence in. So like I said, I think he's going to be highly owned. I think Higbee's going to be highly owned. And basically just because these guys are so cheap that you're almost forced to use them. I think you're going to have a lot of people on Greg Howe. For the same reason, he's just too cheap, and he even though the game script is for them to be throwing at Florida Atlantic, I think he's going to be the guy who gets the most volume from the running back spot. At 4,800, I mean, you almost can't not use him. And even if you don't agree with me on using Kenneth Dixon and you'd rather use a guy like Devontae Booker or Leon Allen, they're not cheap either. Dixon is 10.4, but those guys are like 92, 98,000 as well. So, I mean, you're really only freeing up an extra $600 to $1,000 for yourself, which isn't going to really get you up and get any of those top options anyway. Again, this is going to be a really tough slate. There's only 3 games here, but that's the way that I see it. That's the way I think the breakdown is. I don't think you can pay up for some of the big quarterbacks. I think Doty's a little too expensive until he shows me something. I was expecting much more out of him last week. That was my bad, guys. Again, I didn't think, he was very good last year. Last week, though, he was atrocious. I think it has a lot to do with the wide receivers being banged up as well. But again, Dangerfield's still not playing, so you're in the same situation here. The other guys that you look at, Kaya from Miami, not really a fan of his at all. I don't think I'm going to be paying up for Driscoll in this spot. And again, Wilson should be handing the ball off a lot because they're going to be favored to win here. So you're almost forced to use those quarterbacks that we mentioned. And if you use one of those big running backs, I mean, you're basically leaving yourself with less than $5,000 to spend on every spot. So, there aren't a lot of options. I think everybody's going to be on the same guys. So that's basically my rundown for this Thursday slate of college football. I don't think it's going to be one that I play real big. I think I could see myself playing some 50-50s and some double ups and kind of leaving it at that. Maybe throwing one $3 bullet where I try to go a different way than, the lineup that I just kind of laid out for you guys here. I'm not big on giving out lineups. I kind of want to show you guys how to do it, but that's actually a reason why I'm not a huge fan of this Thursday night slate, because with the way that the pricing is, you're almost pigeonholed into using certain players, and I think you're going to see some really high ownership on a lot of these guys. So thank you guys for joining us for a breakdown of Thursday college football on DraftKings. Be sure to get over to rotocurve.com, sign up for an account if you don't have one already. We got a ton of NFL content up already. We're going to have a lot of college football stuff up there. We have NASCAR stuff up there every weekend. There's forums that are open. So if you have any questions about any other sports, a lot of guys that play MLB over there are always in the chat room talking MLB before lineup lock. So make sure you get over there, start earning your curve points. And as always, stay classy, DFS.